I never thought my life would take such unexpected turns. Looking back, I can hardly believe it all happened to me. I spent years trying to pick myself up, and even now, there are days when the memories weigh me down. It all started shortly before that fateful day. Emily and I had been married for 10 years. I was 36, and she was 34. For most of those years, I thought we were solid, even unshakable. We lived in Denver, Colorado, in a 2-story house we nicknamed the Oak Haven, with its beautiful old oak tree in the front yard. It felt like the perfect family home. We had 2 wonderful children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 8. And although life wasn't perfect, I truly believed we were happy. At least, I thought she was happy. Recently, however, there had been an uneasy silence between us. Emily had grown distant, critical, and cold. She was no longer the warm and supportive woman I had married. Her sharp comments were relentless. At first, they were small complaints about household chores or me forgetting to pick up milk after work. But then they turned into deeper accusations. "You're not ambitious enough, Michael," she'd say. "I deserve more than just scraping by." She'd often point out how my income, while covering our needs, didn't allow for the extras she wanted. Emily didn't work, despite my support for her to pursue something part-time. Whenever I suggested it, she'd snap, "Why would I work? Isn't that your responsibility as the man of the house?" Those words stung, but the worst came during an argument one evening. "Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake having kids with you," she said, her voice filled with disdain. Hearing that from the woman I had built a life with stunned me. This wasn't the Emily I knew. Her frustration wasn't only directed at me, though. It spilled into every corner of our family life. She started turning the kids against me in subtle ways. "Daddy's too busy for that," she'd say when they wanted me to play with them after work. "Daddy can't afford it," was her go-to phrase whenever they asked for something fun. I can't count how many nights I came home from long hours at the office to find the house in disarray, dinner unmade, and Emily scrolling through her phone. She wasn't working, wasn't contributing, and yet somehow, I was the one failing. Hoping to save our marriage, I decided to take on a second job. I thought that if I made more money, she'd be happier. Maybe she'd look at me the way she used to. So, I started working overnight shifts at a warehouse in addition to my regular office job during the day. The workload was brutal. My body was constantly aching, and I barely had time to sleep, but I kept telling myself it was worth it. It wasn't. No matter how hard I worked, nothing changed. Emily remained distant, angry, and ungrateful. The nights I spent working to provide for her and the kids only gave her more ammunition. "You're never home," she'd say. "What kind of father are you?" I felt like a failure, like nothing I did was good enough. One night, I overheard her on the phone. Her tone was softer, almost flirtatious. When I confronted her, she denied anything was going on and accused me of being paranoid. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. Then the accident happened. I remember that day vividly. I was exhausted from working a double shift, but there was no time to rest. I grabbed a quick sandwich, changed clothes, and headed to the warehouse for my night job. It was twilight, the kind of light that blurs shadows and tricks your eyes. I was crossing a quiet street, thinking about the stack of unpaid bills waiting at home, when it happened. The truck came out of nowhere. The driver claimed he didn't see me, maybe he was distracted, maybe he was speeding. All I know is that one moment I was walking, and the next, there was a deafening screech of brakes and a searing pain that swallowed everything. And then, darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit me first, followed by the rhythmic hum of machines. My body felt like it was made of lead, weighed down by plaster casts and a dull, constant ache. A doctor came in shortly after. His face was calm but serious. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, but the accident caused severe damage to your spine. Your lower body is paralyzed. With time and therapy, there's hope for some recovery, but there are no guarantees." His words felt like a punch to the gut. My life, as I knew it, was over. But I told myself I could get through it. After all, I had Emily and the kids. We'd figure it out together. Or so I thought. Emily arrived a few hours later. I was staring at the ceiling, replaying the doctor's words in my mind, when I heard her voice. At first, relief washed over me. She was here. My wife, my partner, my rock. But that relief didn't last long. Her tone was cold, detached, almost like she was visiting a coworker in the hospital rather than her husband. She sat at the edge of my bed, avoiding eye contact. "Well," she said, "at least you're alive. That's what matters." I waited for her to say more, to comfort me, hold my hand, reassure me. But she didn't. "Maybe you could bring the kids next time," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "I'd love to see them." Her response hit like a knife to the chest. "They don't want to see you like this, Michael," she said bluntly. She left shortly after, muttering something about errands. There was no hug, no kiss goodbye. Her visits became a pattern, short, emotionless, and increasingly rare. She'd sit with me for a few minutes, scrolling on her phone, then leave with an excuse about an appointment or an errand to run. One day, I asked her to help adjust my pillow. She sighed heavily, muttering, "I guess I'll have to do everything now. Don't get used to this." That was Emily now, distant, sarcastic, and completely detached. The kids came to visit once, weeks later. Emily dropped them off at my hospital room, saying she had to run to the store. It was the first time I'd seen them since the accident, and my heart ached to hold them. I tried my best to stay upbeat, hiding my pain behind smiles and silly jokes. My daughter, Grace, who had just turned 9, asked, "Daddy, are you going to be okay?" "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "This is just temporary. Pretty soon, I'll be running and playing with you both again." She seemed reassured, but then she said something that made my stomach sink. "Daddy, why does Grandpa come over when you're not home?" I frowned. "Grandpa?" "Yeah," she said, looking puzzled. "He comes a lot. He talks to Mommy, and they lock the door to your room." I felt my heart drop. "What does he look like?" I asked carefully. "He's not Grandpa," she clarified. "He's the man who brings Mommy flowers sometimes." I didn't ask any more questions. Grace didn't understand the weight of what she'd said. But I did. That night, I barely slept. My mind was a storm of questions, doubts, and anger. Who was this man? How long had it been going on? And, most importantly, what did this mean for my family? Emily returned the next day. She walked into my hospital room, calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. But this time, she didn't come empty-handed. She dropped a stack of papers on the small table next to my bed and said, "I'm filing for divorce." Her tone was matter-of-fact, almost casual, like she was announcing she'd decided to repaint the living room. "I'm still young, Michael," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I can't waste my life like this. You're not the same man I married, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life as a nursemaid." Her words felt like a slap across the face. She wasn't just leaving me, she was shattering everything we'd built without a second thought. I didn't respond. What could I say? The next time I saw her was 3 months later, at the divorce hearing. By then, I'd been discharged from the hospital and was confined to a wheelchair. Seeing her walk into the courtroom, confident and unapologetic, made my blood boil. She was accompanied by one of the top divorce lawyers in Denver, a man whose hourly rate probably cost more than I earned in a week. Her posture was relaxed, her expression smug. She knew she had the upper hand. During the trial, her lawyer painted me as an unfit father. He claimed I was irresponsible, financially unstable, and emotionally detached, even before the accident. I didn't have the resources to fight back. My court-appointed lawyer was inexperienced and overwhelmed, and I could feel the case slipping away with every passing moment. The verdict was devastating. Emily was awarded full custody of our children. The only silver lining was that I wasn't ordered to pay child support, mainly because I had nothing to give. My medical bills, combined with the costs of rehabilitation, had drained me completely. But losing custody felt like losing my soul. The second battle came shortly after. This time, I was suing the logistics company whose truck had hit me, seeking compensation for my injuries. I thought I had a strong case. After all, I was crossing the street at a designated crosswalk. But when I rolled into the courtroom, I realized how outmatched I was. The company's lawyers were ruthless. They presented manipulated surveillance footage, dubious witness testimonies, and a narrative that painted me as reckless. By the end of the trial, I felt more like a criminal than a victim. The verdict? No compensation. I was left with nothing, a man in a wheelchair, divorced, broke, and without his children. With nowhere else to turn, I moved back in with my mother. She was in her 60s and still running the small flower shop my father had started before he passed away. It was modest and struggling to stay afloat, but she welcomed me with open arms, sharing what little she had. Many people would have crumbled under the weight of so much loss. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel broken. The betrayal, the humiliation, the overwhelming sense of failure, it all ate away at me. But even in the darkest moments, there was a small voice inside me that refused to give up. I hated Emily for what she'd done to me. I hated the man she'd brought into our home. I hated the system that had failed me at every turn. But most of all, I hated the idea that I might never see my kids again. So, I made a decision. I would fight. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't stay broken forever, not for myself and not for my children. I started with what I had, my mother's flower shop. She'd been running it on her own since my father's death, but it was clear the business needed help. Despite my physical limitations, I threw myself into the work. I researched trends in the flower industry, connected with new suppliers, and modernized the shop. I created a website, started offering online orders, and introduced services for weddings and corporate events. Slowly but surely, the shop began to thrive. At the same time, I focused on my recovery. Physical therapy was grueling, but I refused to give up. Every step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. After a year of hard work, I was walking again. Not perfectly, and not without pain, but I was back on my feet. That's when I met Rachel. Rachel was the owner of a flower distribution business, and we crossed paths at a local vendor expo in Denver. She was smart, driven, and had a kindness about her that immediately drew me in. What started as a professional relationship quickly grew into a friendship, and before long, it became something more. Rachel had a 6-year-old daughter named Lily, a bright and bubbly little girl who reminded me of Grace. Suddenly, I had a new family, Rachel, Lily, my mother, and me. A year later, Rachel and I got married. With her expertise in distribution and my growing skills in business management, we transformed the flower shop into a thriving enterprise. For the first time in years, I felt like my life had purpose again. But even as my new life flourished, the ache for my children never went away. I thought about Grace and Jacob constantly. Were they happy? Were they safe? Did they even remember me? When the shop's success gave me some financial breathing room, I decided to fight for them. I hired a skilled lawyer and reopened the custody case. This time, the court granted me partial visitation rights, 15 days every 3 months. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The day my kids arrived for their first visit, I was a nervous wreck. It had been 2 years since I'd last seen them, and I didn't know how they'd react. At first, they were quiet and reserved. Grace avoided eye contact, and Jacob clung to her side. But over the weekend, the walls began to come down. We went to the park, played board games, and stayed up late watching movies and eating popcorn. By the time they left, they were already asking when they could come back. But there was something bittersweet about their visit. During one of our conversations, Grace let something slip. "Mom's boyfriend doesn't like us," she said matter-of-factly. "He barely talks to us, and when he does, it's always to yell." I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my heart broke for them. I promised myself I would fight for full custody, no matter what it took. The next major battle in my life was with the logistics company that had caused my accident. I wasn't going to let them escape accountability a second time. This time, I had resources, a skilled legal team, and hard evidence on my side. With detailed accident reports, witness testimonies, and security footage that had been overlooked during the first trial, I went back to court. The process was long and exhausting, but I was determined. When the verdict finally came, it felt like vindication. The court ruled in my favor, awarding me significant compensation, including punitive damages for the mishandling of my initial case. The settlement was enough to secure my family's future and ensure my children would never have to struggle financially. When I told Grace and Jacob about the court victory, their excitement was palpable. "Does this mean we can be with you more, Dad?" Grace asked, her voice filled with hope. "That's the plan, sweetheart," I said, hugging her tightly. Around this time, I started hearing rumors about Emily's situation. Despite years of living with her wealthy boyfriend, she had never secured the marriage she seemed to have been aiming for. Apparently, he had no intention of tying the knot, citing financial concerns about dividing his assets. It was poetic justice, in a way. She had left me for a man who saw her as nothing more than a temporary indulgence. But what happened next caught me completely off guard. One afternoon, I was in my office at the flower shop, reviewing expansion plans with Rachel, when my secretary rushed in. She looked flustered. "Michael, there's someone here to see you. She's refusing to leave." Before I could ask who it was, Emily stormed into the office. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, and her eyes filled with desperation. "What are you doing here, Emily?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she paced the room, wringing her hands like someone on the verge of a breakdown. "I made a mistake," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I was wrong to leave you, Michael. I thought I was doing the right thing for the kids, but I ruined everything." Her words caught me off guard, but I kept my expression neutral. "You left me for another man," I said, my tone even. "And now you're here because he doesn't want you anymore?" Her face twisted in frustration. "He promised me security, a future for me and the kids. But he doesn't want to marry me. He says it's too complicated. I don't have anywhere else to go." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the pain she had caused me, the years of struggle and humiliation. "Emily," I said, standing up and meeting her gaze. "I've moved on. I have a family now, a wife who loves me, a stepdaughter I adore, and a life I built from the ground up. Whatever you're looking for, it's not here." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Michael, please. For the kids. We can fix this. We can rebuild what we had." I stared at her, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused me. But instead, I shook my head. "No, Emily. The kids deserve stability, and I've built a life where they can have that. You've made your choices. Now you'll have to live with them." Emily left in tears, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the closure I hadn't realized I needed. After Emily's visit, I refocused on my family and my goal of winning full custody of Grace and Jacob. The court battles were draining, both emotionally and financially, but I refused to give up. This time, I came prepared. My lawyer presented evidence of Emily's instability and neglect, along with testimonies from my children about their life in her household. Grace and Jacob were brave, sharing their experiences honestly and clearly. The court ruled in my favor. I was granted full custody, and the day I brought my children home felt like the culmination of every fight I'd endured. The joy on their faces as they walked into our house, was a moment I will never forget. We celebrated that night with pizza, ice cream, and a movie marathon. Rachel and Lily welcomed Grace and Jacob with open arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. Life wasn't perfect, but it was finally stable. The flower shop continued to flourish. Rachel and I expanded our business, opening a second location and gaining a reputation as one of Denver's top floral services. With the settlement from the logistics company, I was able to pay off lingering medical bills and start college funds for all 3 kids. Grace and Jacob thrived in their new environment. Grace joined a school theater group, and Jacob became obsessed with soccer. Watching them grow, laugh, and chase their dreams reminded me of why I had fought so hard. As for Emily, I heard bits and pieces about her life. After being cut off by her wealthy boyfriend, she moved into a small apartment and took a job at a retail store. She tried to contact the kids a few times, but they were old enough now to decide for themselves. They saw her occasionally, but our bond as a family was unshakable. One day, as I watched Grace perform in her first play and saw Jacob cheering for her from the audience, I realized something important: the struggles, the pain, and even the betrayals had all led me here. To this moment. To this family. Today, my life is better than I ever imagined it could be. I'm surrounded by people who love and support me, and the pain of the past feels like a distant memory. Emily is just that, a memory. And now, my story isn't one of loss, but one of resilience.